Hello, this is Trip Sherwood and Will Jameson on our unnamed podcast. We have an idea, but we don't have a name. So, quick rundown is we will be discussing certain regions in America, their history, the people living in them, and our experiences in them. Starting off in our pilot episode, we are starting off with New England, consisting of the states Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine.
Not New York, because that's not actually New England.
It's sometimes mistaken, but it is not. It's New England.
To get some things out of the way, first, our audio is not quite the best, let's call it, just by nature of how we're recording this. But yeah, we're just going to give this our best shot and kind of just see what we can do with what little we have. Sound about right?
Yep, and hopefully in the next video or whatnot, I will have better audio quality as I'm just recording this off headphones and phone in my room.
Yeah, so...
I didn't realize I would sound this poor.
Well, starting off on our next... this one we're not going to be taking too seriously, just because this is part of our first part. Just stop recording there for a bit, but we're just going to try to interact with this as most authentically as we can, so we can review back through it and kind of hear how we sounded. Right? Does that sound about right?
Yep.
Okay, so let's kind of just start off then. We're looking at the New England states, derived, of course, from the fact that these are some of the most heavily anglicized region. This was some of the places. I mean, specifically, what's it called? Cape Cod was the original area for Puritan settlement, so it's New England, hence the name.
Yeah, it was. You all know about the Plymouth colony and the story of Thanksgiving, but there were other very major important colonies, such as the New Haven colony.
Yeah.
And Rhode Island.
Rhode Island was actually kind of interesting because it was more of a... definitely not... it's more of an outlaw colony because it was basically all the people who didn't fit into the other colonies eventually settled in Rhode Island, which made it such an interesting place because it was basically a bunch of renegades that was kind of just settling in an area. Basically a bunch of heretics would be the best way to put it. They weren't Puritans. Like, there was actually stories of Puritans sending people to Rhode Island because they didn't want them in their, like, holy colony.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of Puritans and the settlement of New England, in fact, the Puritans were not kicked out of England as commonly perceived. They were granted land in New England.
Yeah.
And if they were an enemy of the state in England, they would have been punished as so. But it was a trade-off. You live in the New World, we allow you to live in the world, and
you leave us the hell alone, basically. That was the trade-off the English monarchs made to the Puritans. You go to the New World, and we'll give you your own piece of land, and you leave us the hell alone and get out of our politics, because we don't want you somewhat insane people. Because the Puritans were a bit, let's call them wacky. Let's call them wacky, for lack of a better term. Like, they were very, very strict Christian fundamentalists in a growing world of secularism.
And one Puritan church still remains somewhere in Massachusetts, actually.
Really? There's still a Puritan church?
Yes, it's not operated by the Puritans, as most of them have disappeared through the centuries, but it's, I assume, owned by some historical society. And there's another group that somewhat reminds me of the Puritans, the Shakers, which were it was a Christian group. They all lived communally, but they never had children. They'd adopt children. And once children got to a certain age, they were allowed to leave. And currently, I believe there are 2 Shakers left.
Yeah.
But if you look back at the 1800s, a fair amount of very practical furniture came out of there. A bit of an odd point, but one of their most apparent and useful useful inventions was the buzzsaw.
They create the Shakers, a religious. How did they create the buzzsaw? What do you mean?
They invented the buzzsaw. It was some woman, I forget her name, but she created the buzzsaw. As a better way of sawing. They also
weird
made,
thing.
Plumbing improvements.
It's a weird thing to invent. Created the buzzsaw. Jesus, that's
It's quite an invention.
Yeah, it's just an interesting thing to be created by religious people. I just wouldn't have called it there. I wouldn't have been like, yes, the Shakers, the creators of the buzzsaw. Like, and for anybody curious, no, the Shakers are different than the Quakers. The Quakers are very much still alive. They're still actually a fairly popular religious group in some parts of the Northeast, New England area. They're pretty, they're secular. Pennsylvania still has a lot of Quakers around, as far as I know. Yeah, they got huge sums of, because the Quakers were the more, let's call it, secular-minded group of early religious sects in America. Like the Quakers were part of the whole I believe William Penn was actually a Quaker, and they are one of the more. What's up?
He was a Quaker.
Yeah, he was a Quaker, and so Pennsylvania still has plenty, because they were very much... Puritans had this kind of situation where until the Halfway Covenant, which was this agreement where people could now start to join their church, only if you were a Puritan, only if both your parents were Puritans, could you become a Puritan. And why that would be you could only marry a Puritan if you were a Puritan yourself. So it really was an exclusionary religion. And if you're like a Shaker and you can have no kids, then you're not going to be able to sustain your religious society in this world where dozens upon thousands of people are flooding into the new world. So that's why most of the societies fell out. But the Quakers can have children, they can do everything as far as I'm aware. Yeah. But New England's an interesting place because it's unlike many areas, especially in the southern United States where the other vast majority of English colonies would be made, it can't sustain agriculture at all. So that's why New England...
Mostly because of the rocky soil. If anyone's been around, I know, for instance, Connecticut, where I have some family, driving around, there are a lot of rock walls made decades ago or hundreds of years ago from people dredging up rocks from their yards, which they were turning into farms.
Yeah, Robert Frost's poem, what is it called? To Build a Wall? Something there is that doesn't have a wall.
Oh, I don't know.
Give me a second, I know it. Mending Wall. Robert Frost's Mending Wall. Talks about that in his poem.
As I was saying, I have been to every state in New England with the exception of Maine.
I have been to none of the states in New England with the exception of none of them. I have not been to New England. I don't go to the... if I ever go to the East Coast, it's to New York, just because I have family there. That's about it.
New York isn't far from New England. Southwest Connecticut's about a 45-minute drive.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. I just never do it, because there's enough to do in New York where you don't really need to worry about New England.
Yes, the largest city in America certainly would have
enough to do. Yeah, I mean, well, also New York is just there's a difference, I'd say, between being the largest city and being the most... Because I believe New York is also the cultural capital of America. I think that would be a fair statement to make.
Yeah.
So it just creates this environment where it's there's 50 different things to do if you know where to do them. It's kind of cool. But back to New England.
Back to New England.
Yes. Go ahead.
So, I was thinking on the topic of Native Americans, and there are quite a few tribes in New England, and all of them were Algonquin speaking. Now, the Algonquin languages is quite a large family, spanning the East Coast all the way from northern Quebec, I believe, down to North Carolina, and spreading across Canada probably till I think eastern Manitoba, into Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and there's some outliers like all the way out. Well, actually, I think it spans all the way to Saskatchewan, and a little bit into Montana, where the Blackfeet people are, and they're, I believe, even in California. So it's a very, very large group.
Yeah, it was very expansive in its origin. But the thing to note with many of these language groups are it's more of a what's the best way to put this? There's a difference between language groups, I would call it, as we traditionally see them, in a Latin language group versus this kind of language group. Because Latin also had a very established writing system of kind of characters and symbols. This one would be purely verbal based. So even though these people might understand different segments of words that another might say, it would still be fairly far distant, because distant apart. Would that be fair to say? So it just creates this kind of interesting, where all these languages we at least know share some sort of verbal similarity or linguistic similarity with each other. It'd still be very hard for these people to speak the same language. That's the most important thing you can really get across these points. Even though these guys all come from a similar culture or similar linguistic group, there were so many different various tribes that roamed, because there wasn't, unless you look to places like Cahokia, where there wasn't many. There was only a small political structure. North America just didn't hold vast political entities. It just wasn't the place for it. You would have to go more towards Central America for that kind of factor to start to arise. So all of these people would be most of them would be in separate tribes and separate groups and separate things. Yeah.
Now there's one tribe I'm actually interested in, and that is the Pequot tribe. It was in pre-colonial times. It was a powerhouse, a military. Maybe not military, seeing as they didn't have a like an established military we have now that existed in European countries at the time, but they were powerful and they had the muscle to flex, and they were located in eastern Connecticut. But though through colonization, their numbers dwindled due to disease.
Yeah, as did happen with most Native Americans.
And I'm surprised they still exist today. Mostly because of and I say I'm mostly surprised because of the Indian Pequot War. Now, this was a war, the dates are leaving me, that was in the definitely in the mid 1600s, before 1650, and the war mainly consisted of it was English colonists and other Native American tribes who wanted to get a leg over on the Pequots because it's not very nice to get flexed on, to say the least.
Because the interesting thing about all of this, with the later in King Philip's War, which is a fairly important war in the history of the colonies, and probably the closest the English came to really being dislodged from the colonies, is the Pequots would actually fight on the English side in that war. I'm just saying this whole situation is very interesting because it kind of portrays this whole thing of the Native American system. It should never be taken as one series of one giant group working together in unison to try to act upon one goal. It should always be taken on to note that there's several different tribes and groups of people that are all trying to do different things. Like the St. Philip's War, for instance, there was a couple tribes fighting on the New Englander side because they seemed as that was a more advantageous position to be in. So it's always kind of important to note these are complex affairs that we're talking about.
Yes, the Native Americans are one particular group who see all the rest as some greater group of people against a common enemy. They different groups are in it for different political reasons.
Yeah, they were.
Back to what I've been saying and why I'm somewhat surprised or many cases still around, albeit their numbers have dwindled significantly. So, the war basically started with the English tricking the Pequots into thinking they had left by sailing a boat by their base, heading outward. That boat landed elsewhere, forgetting. And that night, English colonists and other Native Americans went in to sack the camp. And this whole thing started because the Pequots had killed a Dutchman thinking he was English. Or, sorry, an Englishman thinking he was Dutch. And so the English saw this as a viable reason to go after them. So they sacked the camp, but they were starting to lose this little scuffle. So they just burned it down. They started a fire, and I think over 600 people died on the native side. And after this, the rest of the war was mostly a headhunt of colonists hunting and scalping natives, along with non-Pequot natives hunting them down.
Huh. Interesting. No, because the whole thing of New England is, it's kind of interesting to see, even though there were many Native American groups that occupied this region, the notable section of the Iroquois are still around, although they are New York based. There's not really much Native American influence left on New England, mainly due to disease. Like, wars did a substantial part, but disease wiped out 95% of the Native American groups in this region. And then, this being the first area of heavy English colonization, it really just created this situation where not many Native Americans were left when all was said and done. Yeah, so it just creates, I just find that be an interesting kind of situation of how it ended up.
And though, especially in more populated regions of New England, especially Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, the peoples there were assimilated or died out. In Maine, some of these peoples there lasted a lot longer, and their cultural impact, I wouldn't necessarily cultural impact, but their cultures survived far longer due to basically Maine being heavily forested and isolated. The state of Maine, I believe, was admitted in 1811. I may be.
Maine, I think, was part of the Missouri Compromise, 1820. Because you want to know what it was? Because the Missouri Compromise of 1820, they were trying to keep... So, we're getting into a little bit of side history, but the balance between the slave and free states was always trying to be maintained basically from 1800 to 1860, when the South seceded. And the Missouri Compromise of 1820, Missouri wanted to kind of join as a slave state, and the North freaked out because it would mean that there would be more slave states in the Senate than there were free. So basically, it was decided that Massachusetts, if you look at a map, this is a very weird thing, which control Maine, would give Maine up and it would basically be admitted as its own state. Which, if you might notice there, I said Massachusetts owned Maine. Yes, until 1820, the state of Massachusetts also owned Maine.
It didn't own Maine, it was part of Massachusetts.
Yeah, it was actually a part of, that's a fair point. It was an actual part of Massachusetts, which is just weird. I actually heard something about this, and I do not know if it's true. But you know how it's at a certain point, most of the population of Maine actually existed out on the islands, or at least most of the white population of Maine existed on the islands.
I heard the same thing.
So they called Maine the mainland, which was, you get what I'm saying there? It's like Maine, as in Maine. Why it's called the mainland is because it was like Maine was the land where it was basically, so why we call like shore the mainland. It's because it's where land is, and it was called Maine beforehand, which is an interesting thing. I don't know if it's true. I heard that colloquially one time, and I never ended up looking it up, but I was just like, that's an interesting thought, because it really shows kind of how different, just like random factors in society can really shape shape kind of culture, if you know what I'm saying.
Mhm.
Hmm.
But yeah, especially in northern Maine, many Amerindian groups survive.
Yeah, well, the whole of New England is really just a cultural kind of blending of place because there were still French settlers in New England when the U.S. broke off who spoke.
Yeah, northern, just to be clear, northern Vermont, I think a little bit northern New Hampshire, but also northern Maine.
Yeah, are all
As
used to all be.
if you look at the map, it borders Quebec.
Yeah, it borders Quebec, which of course is a heavily French or Francophile place. I believe that's the right terminology. Uh,
And as a little fun fact, um, from part of little Maine history, albeit it goes a bit outside, the Cajuns in Louisiana are descendants from uh, French people from Maine, and why
yeah,
that is because the French had basically control of Canada for or until the 7 Years' War, which the British took control. But there were a lot of French settlers, and the areas of like nowadays probably modern Maine, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. I know certainly for Maine, but I suppose possibly New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Um, albeit this didn't affect Quebec. This that whole area of Maine was called Arcadia,
yeah.
and these Arcadians were kicked out. And where was the other predominantly French, non-British controlled place?
The port of
Louisiana.
New Orleans, which is, if you've ever been curious about why it's called New Orleans, or New Orleans as it would be called French, is because there's a place in France called Orleans. It's in the southwest region of France, and it's just a province of France. So it's kind of just a thing. It's literally new that province.
So the Arcadians went down to the colony of Louisiana, and over time, Arcadian was shortened to Cajun.
Really, that was why. Hmm. I guess that makes sense. That's
So
interesting.
back to New
Well, we kind of been talking
England.
about it. Also, if you want to know how Frankified that place was at one point, the major port, is called New Orleans, and the state is called Louisiana. Now, in American, that Louis is a fairly common name, but it actually comes from the French kings, who I believe there was a total of 18. I want to call them Louis, so it was named Louisiana. Louisiana.
Indeed.
Indeed. Back to New England.
Back to New England. So we had mentioned the name of Maine being from the mainland. I suppose I've heard a few origins of the names, but other names of the states, New Hampshire or New Hampshire,
Yeah,
comes from the English.
region of
I want to say
Hampshire.
province, but it's not a province.
It's district, I believe.
I think it's called
Their
districts.
constituency?
Counties.
County.
They call them
Thank you.
counties.
That is indeed it.
The English county of Hampshire. So it gets its name from there. Vermont actually comes from French.
Yeah.
I think it's Vermont, Green Mountain. And if everyone's ever been to Vermont, one can easily attest to there are many green mountains. And interestingly enough, Vermont did not or was not part of the United States that fought for their independence. They were a separate country and decided to join the United States.
Well, many of the countries, because the whole thing at the start of this nation's history is none of the states really considered themselves part of one country. They were all, like, we're in this for this, but when this is done, we're out. Bye. So many of the states kind of had Commonwealth. They were considered Commonwealths, or like it's called Commonwealth in Kentucky, I believe, because it was the first state to actually join the Union. There wasn't its own kind of thing. No, but it's a very interesting kind of situation. I don't know where Massachusetts. Tried to look this up, but I couldn't find it. Where did Massachusetts come from?
I believe it gets its name from the Massachusetts people, a Native American tribe.
Rhode Island, I believe, was named after. Well, yeah, it was kind of Rhode Island, if that makes sense. It was named after.
The Rhode Island in Greece.
Yeah, Rhodes, very famous island. Actually, was host to one of the ancient seven wonders of the world, the Statue of Rhodes. If it didn't, if
the Colossus of Rhodes.
Colossus of Rhodes. I said the Statue of Rhodes. Yes, the Colossus of Rhodes, which I believe collapsed in an earthquake. Because surprisingly enough, the Mediterranean region is very, very prone to earthquakes. It's not known widely, but there's a lot of them.
All right, and I apologize if anyone hears a loud crashing noise. I have about a 3-foot tower of La Croix cans that I have in my room.
La Croix? La Croix?
La Croix. La Croix.
La Croix.
We might have a francophone audience, albeit the audience for this is most likely going to be some of our friends and us pestering them to look at this and see what we can improve on.
Yes, indeed. And then
Connecticut comes from the Connecticut River, and back to Rhode Island for 1 second. I wanted to say this before I might have forgotten it. I heard something. It might have been when I was in Newport, Rhode Island. Had a museum there, and they had said that it was named after the Isle of Rhodes in modern day Greece, because it had been apparently like a very tolerant place.
Mm-hmm.
And as we stated earlier, many religious rejects, per se, led to Rhodes, or the colony of Providence or Newport.
Yeah. Fun fact, Rhode Island was so filled with radicals, it was one of the few states that didn't vote on the Constitution. It did not. It was eventually forced into it by the other states. That's why, so if you want to, and our whole kind of point with this history lecture is to bounce between different historical concepts and things. The United States Constitution, very specifically, only had to be ratified by 9 of the states, and that was because many were worried in the Constitutional Convention that Rhode Island would not, and it would set off a chain reaction where a bunch of other small states wouldn't. So it was a whole thing indeed. Ended up causing the difference. So in the United States, in the early United States history, there was, I don't know if you know this, there was this whole conflict going on because there was a bunch of really big states. There's places like Rhode Island, which is notoriously very, very small. And the big trouble that the different groups had in forming a stable government, and it's why the Articles of Confederation were so weak, which the Articles of Confederation, if anybody doesn't know, were the first kind of, let's call it the first governmental body of the United States. Why it was so weak was because the small states didn't want to give up any power to the big states. So basically every state had one representative. So that means tiny Rhode Island had this, which had a fraction of the number of people of Virginia, had the same number of representatives in government, which is just kind of doesn't quite work if you're trying to do a functioning democracy. And when they were creating the Constitutional Convention, two different sides wanted two different things. So the small states wanted basically there to be an even amount of representatives from everybody in both houses of Congress, now what would be the Senate and the House of Representatives. And the big states said, no, that's stupid. Why don't we do it by population? Because, of course, the big states want to use their massive population to, be more powerful than the small states. And that's where this thing called the Great Compromise came in, where basically the Senate now has 2 seats per state, and the House of Representatives is just purely based off of, what's it called? Population. which creates this interesting environment. So yes, indeed, and due in large part to Rhode Island is the reason that every state only has 2 senators. Funny thing. Yeah.
Speaking of Rhode Island, they hold I think the yacht championship. It's some sort of yacht racing competition at a Newport.
Yeah.
It's a big deal.
You know that like the name Newport is used in like 50 different cities in the U.S. I think it's some insane number. Like a bunch of different cities use that exact name.
I know there's one in Oregon.
I know for a fact there's one in California.
I'm pretty sure there's one in Oregon. I just want to check so I don't look like an idiot.
Yeah, because I know. I'm looking it up. Named Newport, because it's the name Newport. It's the most generic name ever because it's quite literally a new port. So in England, and so this is a funny thing. I just looked this up, but Newport. Why would it not? There is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 in. Well, there's like 15 in the UK. In the United States, oh my god. In the United States, there's like 20. There's literally 20 different names. There's one in Arkansas. There's one in California. There's another in California. There's one in Delaware, one in Florida, one in Illinois. There's 2 in Indiana, but one was renamed. There's one in Kentucky.
Newport in Oregon. I was right.
There's 2 in Maine. There's one in Maryland. There's one in Michigan. There's one in Minnesota. There's one in Missouri. There's one in Nebraska. There's 2 in New Hampshire again. There's 2 in there's only 1 in New Jersey, 1 in New York, 1 in North Carolina, 1 in Ohio, 1 in Oklahoma, 1 in Oregon, 1 in Pennsylvania, 1 in this is interesting. There's a creek named Newport Creek. There's 1 in Rhode Island. There's 2 in Rhode Island because there's Newport, and Newport County. There's 1 in South Carolina. There's 1 in Tennessee. There's 1 in Texas. There is 2 in Vermont. There is 1 in Virginia. There's another 1 in Virginia, actually. Or no, that might be a news station. That's Newport in Washington. Another one in Washington. Newport in West Virginia. Wait, why? How is there a Newport in West Virginia?
Probably a river.
Yeah, but is it? Wait, I gotta look this up now. I'm gonna get some images of Newport in West Virginia.
While you're looking that up, and not to be off topic, or on the topic of Newport, in Virginia, are you more referring to? Is there like a Newport or Newport News? Because that's the name of the city. Is Newport News.
There's a city called the Newport News.
Yep.
What?
I've been through it. I've been through Newport News.
Okay, I just got linked to an article. These are the 10 happiest places in West Virginia. Hopefully this will give me an image of Newport.
So while you're looking at that, there are lots of things to do in New England. Lots of things to see as there are in any place. But if there's one place you maybe want to avoid, that'd be Bridgeport. There are Bridgeport. Just really kind of sucks.
No, I've never heard of it. Never. I love how you're giving people travel tips, and I'm just looking up.
But if you want to see something interesting, go to Stu Leonard's. It's a grocery store with animatronics.
That sounds terrifying. That sounds absolutely terrifying.
It's not terrifying. It was very fun and lovely. There's one in Stamford, Connecticut that I've been to. No, it was Norwalk.
There's like 3.
It's very fun. And the guy who founded it, I think, spent time in jail for money laundering or tax fraud or tax evasion.
Huh. So I found Newport. There is about 4 houses. About 7, actually. It is on a river, though. It's on a river. It's near the grand city of Parkersburg.
Parkersburg.
Parkersburg, West Virginia.
Wonder if it's anything like Pittsburgh.
Well, you know how it goes, where you're just Berg. I believe it's German for something. I can't remember what it is.
Maybe town or city. Like,
yeah.
I think Polis is Greek in that same regard.
Yeah, so it's kind of most of the cities in the U.S. kind of have that same thing where it's based off of some kind of thing of that nature. Like Bakersfield, it's a good example. Baker, it was actually a guy named Bakersfield is the town I grew up in. Thomas, the guy who founded the city, was named Thomas Baker, so it's Baker's Field. Yeah. And most of them actually aren't based off of like a type of profession. Most of them are based off of like a person, usually.
Or something else.
Or something else. They can be based off of plenty of different things, but if you ever see one that kind of sounds like it's a profession, it's usually just a person named after that profession, I find.
So, back again to New England.
Back again to New England.
Now, I'm the only person in this little chat that's only been in New England. And I'm to all New England. I've missed out on Maine. But my grandfather used to spend. There we go. His summers in Maine and really enjoyed it. So I bet it's quite a lovely state. And one of my friends said the most Confederate flags he's ever seen is in Maine. Quite odd considering that it's
quite opposite the literal
from the closest Confederate state. That most likely being Virginia.
Your home state.
My home state, which we'll get to eventually, which I don't live in real Virginia. I live in Nova. Northern
Still
Virginia.
Inside the state of Virginia. You joined the wrong side. The grand old state joined the wrong side.
My family was in Connecticut at the time.
Yeah, but you moved to Virginia.
My parents moved in like in the 90s for like work.
Still joined the wrong side. If you joined the wrong side 130 years later, that doesn't mean you didn't join the wrong side.
I didn't join the wrong. I can't even choose a side. The war's over, and if it was going on,
you joined in spirit.
He never joined in spirit.
I say he did.
The only spirit around here is like the lingering of Robert E. Lee.
That's you just proved my point. You just said, I was like, you joined the wrong side and you're like, the only spirit around here is Robert E. Lee, you know, the famous Civil War general who fought for the Confederacy.
Have you ever been to Virginia?
I'm just saying, you didn't quite prove your point there.
You've clearly never been to Virginia. And I lived very far north of the state, to say the least. I live very close to DC. And in fact, I go into DC nearly on the daily for school. I'm in DC all the time. Mind you, I'm not walking around Capitol Hill. I'm in a more suburban area because that's where my school is.
Fun time, as always. But I just want to remind everybody, this discussion is about New England and definitely not about a rant. This is definitely not a chance for us to just talk for 30 minutes. No, but I think because we're tending to drift away further and further from New England, I'm just going to say...
Clam chowder is delicious.
Yeah, let's end on that note. Clam chowder is the best. That's one thing everyone can agree on. It's just the best. Any remarking words you want to make here at the end?
I've heard people from Boston are pretty racist, but I've never been to Boston.
Okay, on that wonderful note, we're just going to end right here. Goodbye, everybody.
I like Connecticut.
Bye.